we're researching the right podcasts. We're going through these questions to try and figure out which are going to be the right ones for you. So once we've decided which are the podcasts that we're going to pitch ourselves to as a guest, what should be the next steps? So all of you have worked on your author brand story by this point, using the author brand story as the basis for your pitch. So a pitch doesn't have to be long and it doesn't have to be complicated. We want to write a clear and short piece that we're going to send to someone by email. We don't need to have, it doesn't need to be an attachment. It's just going to be an email. We want to tell them why you would like to be a guest on that particular podcast. So including things like, have you enjoyed listening to it? Do you think they cover interesting topics? So telling them why you like that podcast, why it's interesting to you, which is going to segue into why you then think you could bring some value to it. So what could you bring to that podcast? For example, is there a new perspective that you could add to the themes that are often discussed? Or are you positioning yourself as a must read or as an expert within a particular genre? What is the unique view or unique experiences that you can bring using the author brand story to help you inform that? But really, it's kind of showcasing yourself and saying, this is what you could bring to the conversation that maybe hasn't already been explored. A new perspective, new experiences, telling them something about yourself as an author. What do you have to draw attention to that their audience might appreciate? So this is where you can mention any book or books that you're releasing or that you have released that might be relevant to their conversations. And this is where you have to place yourself firmly within the scope of interest of their listenership. So it's going from what you like about their podcast, what you could bring to it, what you have to offer the audience, and then finally, any evidence that you have that you could give them to show that you've either spoken to groups on the topic before, or that you have kind of amassed a bit of an audience on these topics or in your genre. Or, for example, that you've completed any interviews before. You might have given a talk. You might have, ideally, you would maybe even have a bit of video of you speaking, or you could show them maybe any articles that you'd written, anything like that, any evidence that you have to show that whether you've done an interview before or whether you've talked about this topic or in your genre before. So if you've pitched, so you've sent your email, if you've had a positive response back and that host has said, great, let's go ahead, we'll do an interview. So you're booked in to do your interview. So now you've got to do your work on preparing to be that guest to give the interview. When all's said and done, the quality of the conversation you have is what is going to make your podcast interview or podcast episode successful or not, whether it's going to land with an audience. So I've written down these kind of the key do's and don'ts for you to remember when you're preparing to have that conversation. It is a conversation, it's not a masterclass. So remember that, it's to and fro. The best podcast interviews are the ones that sound like genuine conversations. You don't have to give away everything you know in response to each question. It's not an exam. You're not being tested. You're being asked to offer anything that you want to say, anything of interest that you could bring. So keeping it fairly light and conversational, as in you're not delivering a lecture. And yes, podcasts are often there to educate, but remember, they're also there to engage listeners and to entertain listeners. One big thing to remember is that the person doing the real work on a podcast should be the host, not the guest. So you're not hosting the episode for them, and their listeners have tuned in because they know, like, and trust that host. It's the host's show. and you're there to come in to add, to add some value, to add some entertainment. But it's their podcast, so let them do the work, let them ask the questions and lead it. Podcasts are for using the occasion to self-promote. So ultimately, you're there to promote yourself or your books or whatever you're doing, in addition to that. So there's no such thing in this context as blowing your own trumpet too loudly. That's exactly what you're there to do. So really talking about yourself, what you have to say about your books, about you as an author, that's exactly what you're there for. So, make sure you do it. It's not a time to start being humble about what you do and your achievements and why you do it. So talk about your own experiences, give detail, tell stories. Any great podcast interview includes stories, includes examples. This is what really engages listeners. So, you use stories to illustrate what you mean. And you're not there to deliver what you think everybody wants to hear. You're just there to be yourself. This is the time to be yourself. So, bring your own personality to it. Before the interview, make sure that you've sent your host, so your short bio, your headshots, your links to your website, where people can buy your books, your social media channels, all of that stuff. Those are all the basic things that you want to make sure the podcast host has before you go and do that interview, because you want to send all of those things before, so that they're ready with their marketing. Once you've done that interview, that's when they're going to be starting to market it, depending on their timelines. After the interview, this is 101, make sure you ask the host when they expect to broadcast the episode. So make sure before you go away and don't have any more contact with them, that you know roughly when they're expecting to run the episode, and that they're going to be flagging to you when it's actually running. So it's showtime. So we've done all the preparation. We've thought about what we're going to say. We've got all of our ducks in a row, all of our kind of questions thought about, answers, and we've sent all of our details and our materials over to the podcast host. So on the day, thinking about what do we need to remember when we're going in to do that interview. So a couple of things that we want to have prepared. So we want to stay focused on what you want to say. So answering the questions the way you want to answer them. Remember that this is a potentially really big opportunity, depending on how big this podcast is, how many listeners there are, how targeted those listeners are. Even if the listenership is small, if it's a really targeted audience, that is a big opportunity for you, if they are exactly the listeners that you want to reach. It's an opportunity to sell your story and say what you want to say. So I've put here, have your tip sheet ready. So a tip sheet is basically a piece of paper that you're going to have in front of you when you're doing that interview, that only you can see, ready with your bullet points of the things that you want to make sure you're going to say in that interview. So, making sure we've got our book down, we've got our book release date down, we've got any other information that we want to include, and it's all there in front of you, so that you don't forget in the moment and then come away going, oh God, I forgot to say this, I forgot to say this. So have it in front of you on a piece of paper. Stay focused and try to relax. So before we go into that interview, we want to make sure you're breathing. We don't want to sound nervous and wooden and robotic. We want to sound relaxed. We want to sound like we're having fun and that we're interested in the conversation. So remember, you're not being paid. This isn't a job that you're being paid to do. Like we said, it's not an exam. It's not a test that you have to pass. This is something that is mutually beneficial for both you and the podcast host. So this is something that you've decided, this is the podcast for you. You've got the right audience, you've got the right podcast. So now enjoy it. Try to have fun, and then the conversation will be way more interesting for you and for the people listening. So don't forget to keep breathing throughout, and answer the questions in the way you want to, bringing the focus back always to what you want to discuss. So there are no rules about the answers that you have to give to a question. So don't sit there thinking, oh, I should be giving this particular answer now. Always bring it back to what you want to discuss. And coming back to the point that, this is the podcast host's show, not your show. So if, it's not up to you to fill silences, and it's not up to you to keep a conversation going. That's the job of the interviewer. A good interviewer will always make you feel comfortable, and they will do the work to keep the conversation flowing. If you run out of steam halfway through giving an answer, a good interviewer will come in, will pick you up, and they'll keep it going, and they'll keep asking you relevant questions to get you back into flow. It's not your job to keep the whole thing moving. So finally, we've got your podcast checklist. So when you're preparing to be a guest, remember the following key points. Is the podcast speaking directly to your target audience or potential readership? Is it well established with a large listenership, or is it a newer podcast that's in the earlier stages of building an audience? Think about how much marketing of your episode you'll need to take on to make sure that listeners get onto it and you're reaching the audience. So think about what images, what GIFs, what texts, etc. you're going to have to share. And a good podcast host will always submit those to you. They'll always provide you with images, etc., that you can also share across your own platforms, your own social media, your own marketing platforms, email lists, etc. So think about how much time you'll need to put aside to do that, and make sure that you're getting all the materials you need from the podcast host. And then for the interview itself, preparing your own tip sheet, so that that list of bullet points that is going to help you to get through your interview, making sure that you're saying the things that you wanted to say. And what are you including in your interview? What's the key reason you're there? What are you promoting right now? Is it an upcoming book release? Is it any books that are already out but you're actively selling because you've got a good hook that you're using at that particular time? Is there anything else that you want to sell alongside your books? Are there any events that you're going to be at? Are there any talks that you're giving, etc., etc.? So use the opportunity to really promote everything that you want to say about what you're doing at that time.